Hi everyone, welcome to the introduction of Split SDK video training. In this video, we're gonna explain what is the SDK, how do we use it in our experimentation. So let's get started. Split SDK allows developers to integrate their code to the Split platform. The SDK calculates the treatment based on a user ID. Now, we do have a lot of conditions that can be taken into account, and we call them split definitions. So they're including whitelisting, traffic allocations, and targeting rules. So the Split SDK will actually download all the this information from the Split Cloud when you initialize the factory object, and then once the getTreatment call is issued, then it will actually do all the calculation for the treatment for the current user inside the SDK. So the calculation is done on the client side, not on the server side. Once the treatment is calculated, then of course your code as a developer need to integrate into that piece, and then you're going to decide to show or do not show the feature based on the treatment that this user got. Now, the SDK also allow you to send events, and these are can be any generic criteria defined by the developer or the product manager, and it can be button click, conversion, or purchase, and you can tag the customer ID. This way, the Split Cloud can integrate these events into the impressions and then can show you an analytic view of how your experiment is doing, whether it's having a positive impact or a negative impact on your business. Split SDK supports 10 languages today. So we have the web and mobile, which is JavaScript on the web, which works perfectly with frameworks such as React and Angular. We also have an Android and iOS libraries. On the server side, we also have different languages that a developer can develop. So that's like Go, Java, .NET, Node.js, PHP, Python, and Ruby. All these SDKs support a localhost mode, and we're going to talk about that shortly. In order to use the SDK, you do need an API key, and the API key is basically generated from the Split UI under the admin page, and this will allow you to authenticate against a Split Cloud. Now, you can have multiple environments when you configure your organization, and for example, there are two environments that created by default, which are production and staging. So for the API keys, every environment will have its own unique set of API keys. This way, when you initialize your SDK in every environment, it will have its own unique API key so that we don't mix production and staging. We have two different API keys. One we issue for the web and mobile libraries, the JavaScript and Android and iOS, and the other type of SDK key is intended for the other languages. Now here is a split code snippet for any generic SDK. So first, obviously, we need to import the libraries, and these libraries are all available. They're all open source, and if you look up our document section in our website, you can actually find how to install these libraries into your respective language. So first we import the library, then we initialize a config object which contain configuration parameters. Now, these parameters are extremely important for configuring how the SDK will behave based on how frequently the different threads are running. For example, how frequent will it actually send impressions as a bulk to the Split Cloud? How frequent will it actually check for any split changes? How frequent will it check for any segment changes, and so forth? Next, we initialize the split factory object, which is a standard factory object that we pass the API key that we got from the Split admin UI, and we pass the config object. Then from the factory instance, we can get a client instance so that we can use it for the treatment calls. Now the treatment calls, we simply pass the customer ID, and that should be a unique ID that can identify your customer or the current user that's using your page. And then, of course, we have to specify which split or which feature that we want to enable or disable based on the treatment. Now, the getTreatment call will return the treatment as text, and then you can simply do an if-else block that will decide to enable the feature or not. Now, we have best practices for our SDK code, which is to keep only one instance at all times for the factory instance and the client instance, which we call singleton pattern. This is very useful, obviously, so that you don't have to create a new object every time you need to call getTreatment, and especially useful when you use the server back languages like Java, .NET, and so forth. Now, we also advise to use attribute map object. Now, the attributes are useful when you have conditions specified or attributes specified in the Split rules. So this way you have to reflect all these rules based on the whatever user attributes, the current logged in user attributes. So we recommend that we store all these attributes in a map object, and we're going to see an example of this shortly. Now, we also recommend using only one factory instance and have a client instance per each traffic type. We also recommend to use client destroy call, and this call actually is useful to stop all the background tasks of the SDK. It will stop the synchronizing threads which connects to the Split cloud and download Split changes, and it will clear the cache and flush all the stored unpublished impressions. However, you need to make sure that when you call the client destroy, if you need to use the Split SDK again, you have to initialize the factory object again, because the factory object is also being disabled at this point. Now, as we mentioned before, you can actually use localhost mode. And this is useful if you want to test the SDK without the need to connect to SDK cloud. So this way you can create a file or a text file, and the file contains all the settings of the Split, including any whitelisting or rules or conditions. And then you can point the SDK to this file as if it's reading from the Split cloud. Now, we're ready to deploy our feature into production. So first, as we can see here, there's no whitelisting, no targeting rules, and the default rule is set to off. So our code basically will always get the off when we call the getTreatment. Now, let's say we add these values into the whitelist section, and then we save that Split in the UI. Now, in the code, we need to create an attribute object, as we can see here, and then add to the attribute a simple key pair values that can reflect the same object that we are using as a condition. For example, in this one is a user, and the value, whatever value we can pass. And here we're going to pass ME, which is a value that already exists in the condition. Based on that, when we call the getTreatment call, we actually gonna get an on treatment. Now here is the SDK architecture. We have a client and we have an engine, and the engine is the one that actually makes all the calculation. The engine also has a cache, and that cache will store all the information that are passed from the client and from the fetchers. So the first thing will happen when you initialize the SDK. We get the rollout plans, meaning Split definition, segments, all this information that the SDK needs to calculate the treatment. Then we have a getTreatment call and or a track, and now we have impressions and we have metrics. So then the SDK will actually send and post these impressions into the cloud server. The SDK can also connect to an outside database to store all the cache instead of in memory. This way, we have to use a different process called synchronizer to actually do all the heavy lifting of sending the data back to the Split cloud. Thank you for listening to this video. You can head to the docs.split.io for more information on our SDK.